Hello, children. Welcome back. Today we will tell a story from Grimm's fairy tales, Six Swans. Have you heard of this ancient story? Let's listen to the story together. Once upon a time, there was a king hunting in the big forest. He chased a wild beast with all his might, but his followers could not keep up with him. As it got dark, the king stopped and looked around, and then he found that he had lost his way. He wanted to get out of the forest, but he couldn't find the way. At this time, the king saw an old woman who kept nodding and walking towards him. It was a witch. "Hello," the king said to her. "Can you tell me the way out of the forest?" "Ah, yes, your majesty," the witch replied. "I can tell you, but there is a condition. If you don't agree, you will never get out of the forest, and you will starve to death in the forest." "What is the condition?" asked the king. "I have a daughter who is very beautiful," the old witch replied. "Her beauty is incomparable, and she is more than enough to be your wife. If you are willing to marry her as queen, I will tell you the way out of the forest." The king was worried and had to agree to the witch's conditions. The old witch led the king to her hut, where her daughter was sitting by the fire. The daughter received the king, and her expression seemed to have expected the king to come. The king thought she was indeed very beautiful, but he didn't like her, and he couldn't help but tremble with fear when he saw her. After the king carried the girl to the horse, the old witch told the king the way. After the king returned to the palace, he held a wedding with the girl. The king had been married once before, and his first wife gave birth to 7 children for him, 6 boys and 1 girl, and the king loved them very much. After the wedding, the king was worried that his stepmother would abuse the children, and even more worried that they would be hurt by their stepmother, so he sent them to live in an isolated old castle in the forest. The castle was located deep in the dense forest, and the road was extremely difficult to find. If a witch had not given the king a magical ball of thread, even he himself would not have found it. As long as the king threw the ball of thread forward on the ground, the ball of thread would open by itself and lead the king. The king often visited his beloved children, and the queen found that the king was often not around, and was very curious, always wanting to find out what the king was doing alone in the forest. She bribed the king's entourage with a lot of money, and these people leaked the secret to her, and also told her the ball of thread that could lead the way. From then on, the queen was uneasy until she found out where the king kept the ball of thread. Then she felt relieved. Then the queen sewed a few small shirts with white silk. She had learned witchcraft from her mother, so she sewed a spell in each shirt. One day, the king went hunting on horseback, and the queen took the small shirts into the forest, using the ball of thread to lead the way. The children saw someone coming from afar, thinking that it was their dear father who came to visit them, and they all ran to greet him with joy. At this time, the stepmother threw a small shirt to each of them. As soon as the small shirt touched their bodies, they turned into swans one by one in the blink of an eye, flew into the sky, and disappeared in the distance. The queen returned to the palace, overjoyed, thinking that she had sent these stepchildren away. But the girl did not run out to greet them with her brothers, and the queen knew nothing about it. The next day, the king went to visit the children and found that only his daughter was in the castle. "Where are your brothers?" the king asked. "Oh, don't mention it, dear father," the daughter replied. "They are all gone, and I am left alone." Then she told her father that she saw from the small window of her room that her brothers had turned into swans and flew away over the forest. As she spoke, she also took out feathers to show her father, which they had dropped in the yard and she had picked up. The king was heartbroken, but he never thought that this heinous thing was done by the queen. He was worried that his daughter would be taken away from him, so he wanted to take her back. But the daughter was afraid of her stepmother and begged the king to allow her to stay in the castle in the forest for another night. The poor girl thought to herself, "I can't stay here for another day. I have to go find my brothers." When night fell, she ran out of the castle and walked straight into the dense forest. She walked all night, and the next day she walked all day without stopping until she was exhausted and could no longer walk a step, so she stopped. Just then, she saw a hunter's hut, so she went in and found 6 small beds in the room, but she didn't dare to lie on the bed, so she crawled under one of the beds and lay on the hard ground, preparing to spend the night there. When the sun was about to set, she suddenly heard a rustling sound and saw 6 swans flying in from the window. The swans fell to the ground and blew on each other, blowing off all their feathers. Then their swan skins fell off their bodies like taking off a shirt. At this time, the girl looked at them again and found that they were her brothers. She was overjoyed and hurriedly crawled out from under the bed. Her brothers were also very happy when they saw their little sister. However, their happiness was short-lived. "You can't stay here no matter what," they said to the little sister. "This is a place where robbers are infested. If they come back and find you, you will die." "Can't you protect me?" the little sister asked. "No," they answered. "We only have a quarter of an hour every night to take off the swan skin and return to human form, and then we have to turn into swans again." The little sister burst into tears and cried, saying, "Can't you be saved?" "Alas, it's still not possible," they replied. "The conditions are too harsh. It takes 6 whole years. You are not allowed to speak or laugh, and in these 6 years, you must sew 6 small shirts for us with water porcelain. As long as you leak a word, all your efforts will be wasted." As soon as the brothers finished speaking, the quarter of an hour was up, and they turned into swans again and flew away from the window. The girl was determined to save her brothers at all costs, even her own life. When night fell, she left the hut, walked deep into the dense forest, and climbed a tree to spend the night. The next morning, she collected water porcelain everywhere and began to sew shirts. She couldn't talk to anyone, and she didn't feel like laughing, so she just sat there, with her head down, busy with her work. She spent a long time in the forest like this, until one day the local king came to the forest to hunt, and the hunters came to the tree where the girl was sitting. They saw her and shouted to her, asking her, "Who are you?" But she didn't answer. "Come down quickly," they said to the girl. "We won't hurt you." She just shook her head. They kept asking questions, so she threw her gold necklace to them, thinking that they would be satisfied. But they still didn't give up, so she threw her belt to them, but it didn't help. Then she threw her garter and all the unnecessary things on her body one by one, until she was only wearing her underwear. But even so, the hunters still refused to leave, and climbed up the tree to pick the girl down and brought her to the king. The king asked her, "Who are you? What are you doing in the tree?" But she did not answer. The king then asked her in every language he could speak, but she remained silent. The girl's extraordinary beauty touched the king's heart, and he fell deeply in love with her. The king put his cloak on her, carried her to the horse, let her sit in front of him, and took her back to the palace. Then the king ordered her to wear colorful clothes, so that she became more radiant and beautiful, but she did not say a word. At dinner, the king asked her to sit next to him. The girl behaved dignified and polite, and the king liked her very much. He murmured to himself, "She is the queen in my mind, and I will marry her." A few days later, the king and the girl became a 100-year-old couple. Who knew that the king's mother was cunning and vicious, and was very dissatisfied with this marriage, and often spoke ill of the young queen? Who knows, she said, where did this dumb little girl come from? She is not worthy of being a queen at all. A year passed in a flash, and the queen's first child was born. The old woman took the child away while the queen was asleep and smeared some blood on the queen's mouth. Then she went to the king and falsely accused the queen of being a man-eating monster. The king refused to believe it and would not allow anyone to hurt the queen. But the queen turned a deaf ear to everything and just sat there sewing shirts all the time. The second time, the queen gave birth to a beautiful boy, and the vicious mother-in-law repeated the same trick. The king still refused to believe it. He said, "She is too pious and kind-hearted to do such a thing. If she could speak and defend herself, her innocence would be clear to the world." However, after the old woman stole the third newborn child, she falsely accused the queen again. The queen still did not say a word to defend herself. The king was helpless and had to hand the queen over to the court for trial. The court sentenced her to death by burning. The day of execution happened to be the last day of the 6 years when she could not speak or laugh, and she had already saved her dear brothers from the magic. 6 shirts had been sewn, but the last one was missing a sleeve on the left. When she was taken to the stake, she put the shirts on her arms. She was pushed onto the stake and the firewood was about to be lit. The queen looked around at the last moment, and at this moment, 6 swans flew towards her in the sky. She knew that she was going to be saved, and her heart leapt with joy. Swans flew across the sky and landed near her, and she threw her shirt at them. As soon as the swans touched the shirt, the swan skin on their bodies fell off. Her brothers regained their human form, all lively and handsome, and they stood in front of her, but her little brother was missing his left arm, and a swan wing still grew on his shoulder. The brothers and sisters hugged and kissed each other. Then the queen walked to the king, who was deeply moved, and began to speak. "My dear husband, now I can speak and prove to you that I am innocent and have been falsely accused." Then she told the king about the old woman's evil deeds. She stole her 3 children and hid them. Later, the children were brought to the king, and the king was overwhelmed with emotion. The cunning and vicious old woman received the punishment she deserved. She was tied to the stake and burned to ashes. From then on, the king and queen lived happily and peacefully with her 6 brothers for many years. Okay, kids, today's story ends here. See you next time.